We're going to get going here so that, puts, I hate to put a damper on all the chit chat and whatnot, but my name's Steve Madewell, and I know that there'll be some folks logging in here for our Zoom presentation. And today we are at the Environmental Learning Center at Lake Metroparks. Brad, with Case, has been kind enough to set us up with a Zoom link. He could not join us because he's out checking his salamanders. He's working on his PhD, of course. Tom, I see you've signed in. It's good to see your smiling face. And today
Thank you.
we've got Eugene Braig, who's a professor at Ohio State University, and he's an aquatic species ecologist. And I won't butcher his introduction, but I'll just simply turn things over to him. We've got a nice group of folks that are here in person, so that's a nice change of pace for us. So with that, I'll just let Eugene take it away.
Okay, thanks, Steve. So indeed, my name's Eugene Braig, and my title is Program Director for Aquatic Ecosystems Extension at Ohio State University. And I've been asked to talk about non-native species, so I'm going to do that very thing. Oop, let's see.
Get you going here.
Go. Excellent. So before I get into it, though, I'm going to give you a little bit of vocabulary. So I very often use the term invasive. And when I say invasive, I'm very specifically referring to a legal definition that was created by executive order some time ago. That being a non-native organism whose introduction causes or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human, animal, or plant health. Right. So if I use the term invasive, I'm very deliberately talking about a population of organisms that has two components to this definition, right? It's got to be non-native. It has to come from someplace else, and it has to do some kind of damage or have potential to do damage to something that people value, right? So I won't use the term invasive unless it's got those two components, right? Oops. But perhaps, obviously, only a small portion of non-native species in the aquatic environment come to be considered invasive, right? Not every organism that is introduced to the aquatic environment is going to persist and create large populations that do damage, right? So only some of them are going to be considered invasive, but definitions vary, right? So be aware of that. When I say invasive, that's the definition I'm using, but I have friends in the EPA, for example, who only use invasive when they're talking about something with an expanding population, right? So they, for example, won't refer to common carp as invasive because they're naturalized. They've been here a long time. They're well established. They're not spreading anywhere new because they're already everywhere, right? So they don't call common carp invasive, but I do because they're not from here and they have the potential to damage stuff that people value. So be aware that other people, there are lots of other terms too, right? Non-native, invasive, nuisance, right? Which I might apply to a harmful algal bloom. Some people might even call a harmful algal bloom invasive because it's expanding, given the right conditions, and it has the potential to do damage to things people value, but they're native for the most part. So I'm not going to call those things invasive, right? So be aware that there are lots of other terms, lots of other definitions. If I say invasive, that's what I'm talking about. So what I'm going to cover from this point forward, we'll give you a brief history of non-native things in North America, talk about the policy setting about how these things are managed. We'll give a little bit of time to a committee that I chair, just so you're aware of it. And then a brief list of things that are recently on the move and I find interesting and potentially concerning. Some information resources and getting engaged. So let's give you a brief invasives in North America. And this, a history that was generated by a person named Cindy Kolar, who I know, and I like it, so we'll use it. And we're going to break it into several eras, the first of which we're going to talk about really early in the history of the United States, and then move up to the 1950 era with this first era. Does anybody know what the first documented non-native species in North America is? The first one documented, established in wild places.
Can we guess?
You can please guess.
House sparrow.
That's a good guess, but they're not aquatic.
Trout. I would say some species of trout.
That's another good guess, but not quite right.
Carp. Goldfish.
Carp is closer. Goldfish, fantastic. Absolutely. Goldfish, right? A pet organism. The first documented population of non-native aquatic things was goldfish in the Hudson way back in the 1600s. And then we had the efforts of the early U.S. Fish Commission, right? This is a government agency that was at its foundation, right? At the time we were coming off the Industrial Revolution, fisheries in North America were beginning to struggle a little bit. And so there was this government agency established to try to encourage fisheries and kind of bypass those negative effects of the Industrial Revolution and crashing fisheries to follow. This is the entity that eventually became, it's been split into other organizations, other agencies since, but it ultimately became mostly the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And their early efforts, we're talking about European colonials. So they didn't necessarily value the native species to North America. So they came here with a package of things that they considered valuable, like brown trout and common carp. And so their early efforts were to establish these European things in North America, but also they first colonized along the coasts in large numbers. So they also wanted to move valuable Atlantic coast things like striped bass and Atlantic shad, and valuable West Coast things like the Pacific salmonids and steelhead across to the other coasts or into the interior, right? So those were the early efforts. Not a lot of thought other than creating useful fisheries for human beings, but probably not doing it the best way possible. This was also the time that we had the canal era, right? Before we had railroads, we moved products across the landscape by digging trenches in the earth and filling them with water and having mules drag barges to and fro, right? And when we created these canal systems, that created pathways that allowed things to migrate of their own accord, including non-native things. Anybody know what this is? You get no points if you tell me it's a train.
A fish stocking train.
That's pretty good, right? So this is actually a U.S. Fish Commission fish car, right? And the last one wasn't decommissioned until 1947, which is why we end this first era at about 1950, right? So technology was improving. They had tanks full of water. One of these would roll into town and you could show up with your milk can and get a can full of carp to put wherever you damn well pleased. Or maybe it would cross a trestle and see a pristine river and say, hey man, this river needs some carp. And so it got some carp, right? And these things were riding the rails until almost 1950. Next era, we're going to talk about moving up to about 1975. And this was the era of improved transport and aquaculture escapes. So we had World War II. New technologies were developed during World War II. The volume of shipping became vastly larger. We were moving a lot more quantity of stuff across the ocean. And this was the era that we first found the escapes of the so-called Asian carps, which is a bad term. Don't use that term. It's a nonsense term, but people recognize it. This was also the era where we first documented and recognized that when we're moving fish around, we have the potential to be moving fish diseases and fish parasites, right? So we start documenting that as well. Now, moving into the modern era, we've shifted much more to kind of unauthorized introductions and really increases in shipping volume. So 75 to about the present time. Yes, we still have management agencies stocking game things to wild places, but it's not on that kind of continent-wide scale that those early efforts were. It tends to be much more localized, usually by state or province, but often even more local, sometimes by municipalities, for example. We tend to think much better about the cost and benefit analyses associated with such introductions. So yeah, we still do some introductions, but they're usually better thought out than they were in the distant past. What has really, really increased though is the escapes of organisms in trade, people just not being good stewards of the organisms that they buy as pets or ornamentals, right? Also, we've had a tremendous increase in shipping volume that came with an increase in the movement of ballast. And we'll talk more in a little more detail about that soon. We also have in dense urban places where you've got really big populations, we have a higher demand for live organisms in the food market. And sometimes those things are released to the wild, again, by people being less good stewards. So this modern era is mostly dominated, new introductions are largely dominated by people, just individuals, being poor stewards of live things. Common pathways of introduction. The first we're going to talk about is ballast, right? So a big cargo vessel, it's got to carry weight. And so if it's not carrying weight, of course, it's designed to carry a huge amount of weight. We're talking sometimes vessels that exceed 1,000 feet long, right? These are big vessels that need to be loaded in order to operate correctly. So if you've got a big vessel that's supposed to be full of heavy stuff and it's not, right? It comes up on the water and falls over and everybody dies. So that's just not usually appreciated. So if it's not full of cargo, it's got to have dead weight, which is called ballast. And way back in history, that was stone. Might carry seeds to something like a purple loosestripe, a plant on that stone. But in modern times, the huge volumes we have is water, right? So we've got a big vessel in Eastern Europe, takes on fresh water in a port as ballast, crosses the Atlantic Ocean, comes into the Great Lakes, maybe loads up with steel. As it's loading up with steel, it's got to discharge its ballast, right? And if it had fresh water ballast from an Eastern European port, it might be releasing all kinds of organisms into our ports, right? Now, that's largely been mitigated, and we'll talk about that soon. So we'll move on. Barrier removal, right? Canal construction, which we already discussed. Highway ditches create artificial wetlands that just link everything across the North American landscape, which in part is why we've got such widespread things like common reed, Phragmites, right? Or narrow-leaf cattail. We've got, or in my neck of the woods, what's really prominent recently is poison hemlock, which is really, really toxic. Don't put that stuff in your mouth. But we've got all these artificial wetlands as highway ditches that connect places as vectors for moving aquatic things, especially plants. It's also the downside of dam removal, right? So you might be familiar with the Harpersfield Dam, which isn't far from here, right? It's an old mill dam. The mill hasn't been operational for probably a century or more. But that dam in part is maintained because to remove it would open up a tremendous length of spawning habitat to invasive sea lamprey, right? And we don't want to increase numbers of invasive sea lamprey because they're a parasitic fish that are very harmful to the native fisheries. Another pathway is intentional authorized stocking to introduce something that was once desired. That's how common carp got here, right? Introducing vast numbers of carp that was, it also, in the wake of the Industrial Revolution, but it also followed kind of a revolution in aquaculture, and that for the first time, people were able to fertilize eggs in an artificial environment and raise them in a hatchery. And that actually happened in Cleveland, Ohio, a guy named Theodatus Garlic. He should be your hero. Look up Theodatus Garlic. But the thought in the mid 1800s was that aquaculture was going to cure world hunger. And so there was a big effort to move things like common carp that are no longer valued. And as we've discussed, accidental releases have become much more prevalent in recent times.
Eugene,
Yeah.
common carp were introduced as a food source. Is that
what? So yeah, they were introduced with the intent to create fisheries. Big, fast-growing animal that in Eastern Europe people love to eat, and it just never caught on. There were huge advertisement campaigns that were put on by the federal government, right? They would issue recipes of to try to encourage people to eat them, like carp with jellied slime or whatever the hell they call it. It was a crazy campaign, right? And yes, it was largely deliberate to try to create a fishery that would sustain people who needed food. Let's focus a little bit on the Great Lakes just because of where I am. And I'm going to draw a lot of information from a paper that was published by a friend up in Michigan named Rochelle Sturdivant. And you can see a breakdown of the different groups of organisms. She updated an older paper by a guy named Mills, who just cataloged all the invasions to the Great Lakes into the early 90s. And then she followed up with her paper, which was published in 2019, but going to data that were just a little bit before 2019, right? Because it takes some time to publish stuff. And what I want you to notice here is that all aquatic plants that are listed were listed before she published her paper, right? So all the aquatic plants listed came before 1993, at least in that paper. Now, there's been one introduction since, but aquatic plants have largely kind of trailed off, with the one exception we'll talk a little bit about. And what has become more prevalent in the modern era, post 1993, right, were people recognizing microbes, and that might just be because we're better looking for them, and crustaceans, especially zooplankton. So she describes several eras of invasion to the Great Lakes. So, oh, and also note this graph, right? So here we've got red and yellow are things that are considered invasive, right? Things that do potential harm to people systems. The gray are kind of unknown whether or not they're positive or negative. The blue is no effect, and the green is beneficial, right? And so note about a third of those organisms that have been introduced to the Great Lakes come to be considered in some way invasive. And note the little green band of beneficial. Note how vanishingly small that is. And that might be something like steelhead, right? Which are not native here, but have been stocked here. And most people consider them some benefit to things people do. So this first wave was dominated by deliberate introductions in canal building, and that's going way back into the late 1900s or 1800s, late 19th century. The second wave was dominated by unintentional, but also still deliberate introductions, and here we're getting into the early 20th century. And then the third wave, you'll see really a sharp increase in the numbers of things, and that was dominated by ballast water. But I'm going to zoom in just a little bit on the last 50 years. And what I really want you to notice is that in just the last couple decades, it's kind of leveled off on the Great Lakes. And that's largely because of ballast water exchange, in that vessels that come from overseas ports are required to stop in the Great Lakes and swap out their ballast with salt water, so that any freshwater organism in those ballast tanks is going to be killed. So that's largely what has recently staved off the invasion of the Great Lakes in a big way. Of course, there are going to be effects of invasive species. Economically, it's been estimated, and this is numbers 10 years old now, right? So add 10 years of inflation to this. But it's been estimated that dealing with aquatic invasive species, right, cleaning zebra mussels off of power plant intakes, the loss of property value because of dense coverage of some aquatic plant or something, right? But it's been estimated to cost the entire Great Lakes region more than $100 million each year in dealing with these issues. Environmental things, right, we can think about in terms of energy, right? So we've got a new invasion comes in, and it either preys upon or parasitizes native populations. It takes energy away from those native populations. Or if it's a competitor with native things, is preventing that energy from getting to my native populations. They might disrupt habitat function, right? If I've got a soft substrate wetland with lots of native aquatic plants, and all of a sudden it's covered with the gravel-like substrate of zebra mussel shells, that habitat is very substantially changed on a very large scale. If we've got things that are closely related, we might have some genetic disruption of our native populations, either intergradation, if we're talking about the same species from a different watershed, or even hybridization if something's close enough. Now, sometimes we actually have a non-native organism serving as a food source for a native organism that provides a small benefit. An example of that is the round goby, right? Round goby is a fish that was introduced to the Great Lakes and became widespread. It's a bottom-dwelling fish, and there's a native species, a subspecies of northern water snake called the Lake Erie water snake that was listed on the federal endangered list. Now it's been delisted largely because it's got a belly full of round goby, right? Round goby are everywhere, they're abundant, they're easy, and that very directly contributed to the recovery of this endangered subspecies. However, that also is often a double-edged sword. So round goby in their home range eat a lot of zebra mussels. Zebra mussels are very fatty tissue. that's really good at absorbing the persistent toxins like PCBs, right? So zebra mussels come in, sit in the substrate, load up on PCBs. This is an industrial chemical, right? It's not been used for decades. It's illegal. It is really toxic and really persistent, right? So zebra mussels sit in the substrate. They start accumulating all of those historically sequestered PCBs. It concentrates in the zebra mussel tissue, which is very fatty. Then the round goby eat a lot of zebra mussels, and then something like a smallmouth bass eat a lot of round goby. Every level up that food web, the toxin gets more concentrated. That's called biomagnification. So in the years following round goby introduction, no new PCBs going into the system because they're illegal, right? No new PCBs coming in, but in the years following round goby introduction, on average, concentration of PCBs in smallmouth bass tissue tripled on average with no new introduction of that chemical because of that new thread in the food web that was created by zebra mussels to round goby to smallmouth bass. And the real big changer is shifting bioenergetic flow, right? The shifting of energy up the trophic levels, right? So here we've got the classic food pyramid, right? And something like, and I don't think, oh, you can see my cursor, cool. So something like, oops, but it's advancing as I tap the little mouse pad, damn it. So we've got something like a snakehead, right? Predatory fish, big teeth, gets a lot of press because it's a big predatory fish. And that's the kind of thing that gets a lot of press. It operates there, right? And it might have some trophic effects that kind of move up and down the system, but directly influencing populations is eating the fish that are a little bit smaller in it. It doesn't really change the system. But instead, if we introduce a super effective planktivore, something that eats a lot of plankton, it's cropping the very base of my system down here, right? So if we put in a bunch of zebra and quagga mussels or something like a silver carp that's really good at eating a lot of plankton, it just makes less energy or a different form of energy available all the way up the food pyramid. So there's going to be less of everything. And when we're talking about the Great Lakes, there is tremendous value associated with the Great Lakes fishery. 2.2 billion spent on accessing the Great Lakes fishery. Now, that's not only directly on fishing equipment or whatnot, but it's buying gasoline as visitors come, renting hotel rooms, etc. Right? So 2.2 on trips for recreational fishing to the Great Lakes alone, and the total economic driver of the Great Lakes fishery, including commercial things, has been estimated at more than $7 billion per year. That's a lot of money that I don't want to risk. Let's talk about policy quickly. So the biggest one I'm going to dwell on is the NANPACA, which was later, so that's the Non-Indigenous Aquatic Nuisance Prevention and Control Act, which was later revised and condensed to become the National Invasive Species Act. And through it, it created an Aquatic Invasive Species Task Force, or Aquatic Nuisance Species Task Force is how the law is written, although our terminology has changed. It's still called the Aquatic Nuisance Species Task Force. We'll talk about that more soon. There are others, like the executive order that I've already discussed. The Lacey Act, which was a really big one, that lists organisms, animals as injurious. And it used to forbid interstate transport of those organisms, but that was kind of de-toothed by a lawsuit. Toothless people that like to sell giant restrictors to people in Florida, right, sued the feds and removed the ability to restrict interstate transport directly by the feds. However, if a state blacklists a thing, that will still invoke a Lacey Act violation. So now it's kind of up to the states to name those things that are blacklisted by state, and that will invoke the federal violation. Plant Protection Act, which largely deals with plants, but also deals with, it's kind of expanded to also cover like diseases that might occur in aquaculture facilities. And the Vessel Incident Discharge Act, which was stalled for years, but then it passed in a surprising way, right? I was afraid that when the bill was introduced, it would remove the requirement for ballast water exchange. But when it passed in a surprisingly useful way. And so, especially at the time it was passed. So the ballast water exchange is preserved. But I won't dwell too much on these because it's legal and kind of dull, but I will talk a little bit more about the Aquatic Nuisance Species Task Force, which implements the Invasive Species Act by developing programs to prevent introduction and dispersal of aquatic invasive things, to monitor, control, and study those non-native populations, conduct research, and coordinate programs and activities, especially among different agencies, including among different jurisdictions agencies, and to educate and inform. And the Aquatic Nuisance Species Task Force is advised by and sends funding into the states by 6 regional panels. And Ohio sits on 2, the Great Lakes panel and the Mississippi River Basin panel. On those panels, so the primary representative of a state is going to be somebody who works for the management agency. In Ohio, that's going to be a guy named John Navarro at present, but there's been some retirements and some things moving. I don't know that John Navarro will maintain this position because he might climb the food web. We'll see. But for now, it's John. We have an alternate to the Great Lakes panel, a friend of mine named Tori Gabriel, who works for Ohio Sea Grant. And the alternate and the past chair of the Mississippi panel is me. By state, the state authority largely falls to the state agencies that are charged with management and regulation of natural resources. So especially regarding animals, that's going to be the Division of Wildlife within the Department of Natural Resources, with some other roles falling to other agencies. For example, the Ohio Department of Agriculture deals a lot with invasive plants, including aquatic things. State maintains an invasive species management plan. Maintaining that invasive species management plan qualifies us for a little bit of funding through the feds via that Invasive Species Act. And there is a stakeholder to provide input to the state, a stakeholder committee to provide input to the state on management topics. So let's talk about that committee. Okay, we are an informal advisory to programs of the state, especially the Division of Wildlife. We typically meet twice a year. You can look at our webpage, right? Don't write down these beastly URLs. If there's one link you should write down, it's my email address, because I can get you whatever of the stuff you'd like. Our mission statement is to provide a forum for Ohio's diverse stakeholders, its resource management agencies, related industries, and organizations to advise the state about the prevention and control of aquatic invasive species, and for the state to inform those stakeholders about developing issues and policy. Right? And that's a fair encapsulation of what we do. Our membership is deliberately diverse. It includes agencies, both state and federal, that have operations within the state of Ohio. It includes municipalities, right? Those with large active park districts, those who manage zoos, they have representation on the committee. Non-government organizations like the Nature Conservancy, for example. Industry representatives, we have representation from Great Lakes Shipping, from the aquaculture industry, right? Fish farming. And of course, academics like myself, et cetera, right? So diverse membership that is deliberately selected to provide useful input to the management of invasive things to the state. Some recently vetted policy, there is a determination of injurious aquatic invasive species in Ohio, which is administered by the Division of Wildlife and the Department of Natural Resources. And if we designate something as high risk, then it is kind of forbidden to culture in the state. Yeah, and the committee that I'm describing has some role in vetting proposed listings to that list. There's also a Department of Agriculture administered invasive plants rule that was first implemented in 2018 and substantially revised in 23. That list can be revised rather quickly by a 5-member committee. Now they're a formal committee, so their membership is appointed by or approved by the governor's office, where the invasive species committee that I'm talking about and chair is deliberately informal. So we don't have that kind of governor's office vetting. So we can operate kind of a little under the radar, but they can revise very quickly as necessary. You can see the rule there. Regarding aquatic species only. So here are the initially listed aquatic or wetland species in that ruling. I'm not going to read it in detail. If you've got questions about any of these things, do feel free to ask. But I will tell you that the kind of the default status on this first listing was these were organisms that were already present in Ohio for the most part, often widespread, that we recognized as a problem and didn't want them to spread even further, with some exceptions. And you'll see those exceptions in numbered footnotes. So have a quick look there. If you got questions, feel free to ask. But then in 2023, we proposed a very substantial revision added a lot of species, and to my surprise, there wasn't any kickback on any of them, including some things that were really popular ornamentals like yellow iris, right? So here's the 2023 revision with, again, only the wetland and aquatic species listed here. And the default on this list is these were mostly organisms that were not yet present in Ohio, and we didn't want to come here and become a problem because they were demonstrated to be a problem in other places where they have invaded, with some exceptions like yellow iris, and those exceptions again are listed in the footnotes. So have a quick look and ask questions if you got them.
Who enforces or what's the regulatory for that?
So this is the Department of Agriculture, and so a plant that's listed by this regulation cannot be bought, sold, or given away. It can't trade hands. It's illegal to willfully disseminate this plant. Mostly the enforcement comes from the Department of Agriculture's inspection service, where they have very limited number of inspectors who might visit a nursery. And if they see a thing listed, you know, they say, don't sell that anymore or get a fine.
And so the penalty component is an action that involves a fine.
Yes.
Is there a criminal component to it?
That I don't know. It comes up so rarely because ordinarily when somebody is, it takes some time for this information to even trickle into the nursery industry. So very often they're still selling a thing just because they don't know it's illegal. And very often if you tell them it's illegal, they stop. But if it comes to legal action, I frankly don't know. That would be a question for friends in the Plant Inspection Service at the Department of Agriculture.
I mean, I think specifically things like park affairs.
Right, so that was one that was a strange one. Invasive pears, right, were listed as invasive with the first listing, but they were attached to a 5-year grace period so that nurseries could frenziedly sell off as much stock as quickly as they could, which is perhaps like the antithesis of the intent of the law, but they are now listed. And so their grace period has expired. You can't sell Bartlett pears any longer. So there you go. Another weird exception you'll note on this list is reed canary grass, right, which is recently listed with one exception, because reed canary grass is a wetland grass. It's popular among people who raise grass-fed cattle. So you and I cannot buy, sell, or give away reed canary grass without breaking the law, unless we're selling it or giving it to somebody who's raising cows, right? Because it's a wetland grass that does really well in wet places, and if I've got cows on wet pasture, it's probably what they're eating. So there are weird exceptions. We got to live with it.
How much do you expect this to change under the current political climate?
So one of the nice things about Governor DeWine, and I'm a little reluctant to go too deeply down the political rabbit hole, but Governor DeWine, for all of his shortcomings that I perceive as real substantial shortcomings, he has been very friendly towards natural resources issues, right? And so, for example, this huge revision came under DeWine. Now, the panel that makes these decisions are 5 members who are appointed with the approval of the governor's office, but it's not likely that panel will change with much frequency because this is frankly far away from the attention of the governor. So I don't know that it will have this is an Ohio-based regulation. I don't know how substantially it will change unless somebody brings it to a governor's attention and he gets a bee in his bonnet about it, right? But for now, things are potentially friendly for the moment.
How about with respect to your committee and the loss of federal funding? What impact is that going to have?
So my state committee, I don't think it will have substantial effect directly. However, with the Mississippi River Basin panel, the advisory to the national, most of the membership are state-based. However, there's a lot of input from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, from the U.S. Geological Survey, including staff time dedicated to running those regional panels of the National Aquatic Nuisance Species Task Force. And right now, I do not know. Mm-hmm. We had our last meeting in mid-February. It was a great meeting. And then that's when all of the hatchet started falling immediately following that. And our next meeting is supposed to happen in September in Kansas, and I will know more by September.
Could be a lonely meeting.
Could be, but most of us again are state representatives. However, I travel to those meetings myself with indirect support that comes ultimately from the federal government, right? The panel pays me to be there. Now, the panel is administered by an interstate cooperative, but their funding comes from the feds. And so once again, it's kind of up in the air right now. So let's talk about some things that are recently doing stuff in Ohio. I should update this. I last updated about a year ago, but I pulled these data from a national database that's quite useful and that I hope persists. And you can see the breakdown of how many things we have in Ohio. So that open number is going to be the total number of species we have in Ohio that came here from someplace else. The number in parentheses are things that are native to North America, but not native to Ohio and have come here from someplace else in North America. Right. And there are some things I've subtracted, right? So for example, triploid and diploid grass carp are both listed on this database. So I've subtracted one to only represent that species once. So you can see the breakdown of what we got in Ohio by the numbers of types of organisms. Again, ask questions if you got them. Let's start by talking about some plants of interest. Hydrilla, right? It was the bane of southern marinas, just choked out marinas, made boating impossible. Nobody thought it would do well here, but it's been thriving here pretty well since about 2012 is when it first became widespread and first discovered in parks a little bit east of Cleveland. But recently on the move, so new to Alum Creek Lake in a big way in 2022. Alum Creek Lake is in central Ohio. Brand new discovery of a stand in Seneca Lake, and new discoveries in northeast Ohio in Cuyahoga Heights and Mosquito Lake. Now this it became really, by 2012, it was really widespread along the Ohio waters, the Ohio River. And most of the invasion is encroaching into Ohio's southern and eastern reservoirs as boats trailer the stuff carelessly off of the Ohio River. European frogbit, it looks a lot like water lilies, but it's tiny, right? We've got leaves that are only a couple and a half inches across, really tiny, but very pretty white flowers. Looks like tiny water lilies. It doesn't root, it has roots, but they just kind of float without attaching to anything. First reports in 2017. I never saw any of it until the year to follow, but it became really widespread by 2019 in the western marshes of Lake Erie, and by 2022, it was all along the marshes along Lake Erie. Yellow floating heart, it's like, again, like water lilies, but small, where European frogbit is tiny, yellow floating heart is small, right? So we've got leaves that are, 5-7 inches across and small yellow flowers. This is easy to identify because if it's in flower, the flowers are yellow and the margins are really distinctively fringed, right? Kind of like lacy the way they wave. And this one is really good at the leaves kind of cup and isolate pools of stagnant water where mosquitoes can reproduce. So it's really good at making a lot more mosquitoes. It's got hairy seeds that are easily tracked around. It was brought here because it's pretty, so as an ornamental, and there were no new observations in Ohio from 1940 through 2005, right? It just seemed to have stalled. But then in the last couple years only, starting about 2017 but going into the present, there have been a lot new observations of this plant moving to new places around Ohio. Pink lotus, right? We've got a native lotus that has flowers that are yellowish, greenish, orangish. The pink one has flowers that are pink or pinkish white with hints of green and whatnot in there. It's never been assessed as potentially invasive to Ohio because it, again, was considered too much of a southerly thing that would never do well here. But when I started in the role I occupy now in 2012, I knew of 3 populations in southern Ohio that were persisting, and now I know of at least 3 as far north as Delaware County, which is the northern parts of central Ohio. There was an observation in Geauga County in 2022, but I don't know if that's been persistent. I don't know if it's overwintered. Honorable mentions to water lettuce and water hyacinth that have new observations around Ohio, but it's considered fragile in Ohio. And frankly, I don't know if any of these populations are persisting. But last year, I saw the most epic coverage of water lettuce I've ever seen in Columbus, and with a bit of water hyacinth in the margins. So if there is a place where it's going to persist, I'm eager to see what happens this spring, to see if any of these plants have survived the winter, because there was a lot of it there. And if it's going to happen, it's probably going to happen there. But just honorable mentions there, because again, I don't know if any of these guys are persisting through our winters. Invertebrates, red swamp crayfish. I first collected red swamp crayfish in the mid to late 90s in western marshes of Lake Erie. They're a congener with a native we have in Ohio called white river crayfish. And of course, the red swamp is the really important food crayfish in the South, down in Bayou country, Louisiana and whatnot. It's also, though, very popular to biological supply companies. And I suspect much of Ohio's invasion came from the fact that a grade school teacher would buy a crayfish from a biological company, put it in a tank, right? And at the end of the school year, you can't flush Pinchy, right? You got to let Pinchy go in the nearby pond. And so off he goes. And there you go.
They were a food source.
Oh, absolutely. So if you buy etouffee,
You could eat them.
that's what you're getting. I'll take your serving if you don't want it. Fishes, grass carp is the big one, right? So grass carp, still legally stocked to Ohio to control aquatic plants. It's an herbivore, which is rare among fishes, and it is a voracious eater of aquatic plants. Now, in Ohio, if you buy through proper channels, you can only buy sterilized fish. And so I do not think that the legal trade of these fish in Ohio is a source for invasion. And that's been tested time and again, and there have been no escapes or illegal sales documented from licensed vendors in Ohio. I really don't think that that's a source of invasion. But there is a problem in that jurisdictions that ban use of grass carp outright often have black markets. And if there's a black market, there is no incentive to buy sterilized fish, right? It's a lot cheaper to produce fertile fish because it takes an extra step in the processing to shock each egg individually of the sterilized fish. So, if you've got a black market to a place that bans all grass carp, there's the potential to move fertile fish. And we had first evidence of spawning. They collected juvenile grass carp on the Sandusky River tributary, in central Ohio to Lake Erie in 2012 that were of the 2011 year class, right? So they were spawned in 2011. And you can study the chemistry on the inner ear bones of fish and determine their origin. And these fish would definitely spent their early life in the Sandusky River. So I remember 2011, right? Lots of high water going late into the year. And I thought, man, if it takes a year like this to produce a year class of grass carp in Ohio, we might not see something like that for 30 years. And if we're only having a spawning event every 30 years, is that going to create a problem population? Probably not. Well, guess what? Things change. And we had that again in 2015 and 17, and then 18, 19, and every year since, right? So we're having longer periods of high water into warmer periods of the year. These guys are consistently spawning on the Sandusky River and now moving into the Maumee River as well. Pond loach, small fish popular in aquaria. They were sometimes called oriental weather fish, right? They're kind of parallel family to minnows, or related to minnows, and people would put them in aquaria. They're called weather fish because they'd go bonkers when the barometric pressure changes, right? But they've escaped to Ohio, where they found a whole bunch of them trying to cross a flooded road on a spawning run one spring in 2019, and that there were large numbers of them at that time means that there's probably a population there that nobody had noticed.
How big are
So some in their home range, you'll find some that are big, but for the most part, if you see a wild one around here, you're not likely to find one bigger than like this, right? Whether or not these come to be considered invasive, though, is still open to discussion because they occupy a niche that not a lot of our native fish do, and I don't know that they will get in the way of our native fishes. Certainly not native. Hopefully they don't become invasive. Western mosquito fish, right, which is not native to Ohio, but was popularly sold to eat insect larvae. Now, the one thing about this is that we have lots of native insectivores that are just as good at eating insect larvae, but they're disadvantaged in that nobody put mosquito in their name, right? So people like to buy mosquito fish to eat insect larvae, which they do very well, but they also are potential competitors with black striped top minnow or central mud minnow, native fishes, or even blunt nose minnow, right? Native fishes are equally as good at eating insect larvae. Now, when I started in this line of work, if you saw a mosquito fish in Ohio, it was a rarity. And the epicenter of invasion was the city of Toledo that still makes them available to whoever wants them to put in a pond, and Denison University in Granville, Ohio. These were the two places where mosquito fish were first introduced. And if you caught a mosquito fish in Ohio when I started in the business, it was, again, rare and likely in the immediate proximity to those epicenters. But in the last 10 years or so, they are now in, well, they started kind of encroaching into the western Lake Erie marshes, I'm sure from those Toledo stockings. And then you can find them in the backwaters of almost every large river in Ohio now, if you do a little bit of looking. And that's a relatively recent development. Silver carp, those, the so-called flying carp that pummel jet skiers on the Mississippi and the lower Wabash and things like that. Really efficient planktivores, they eat a lot of plankton. They've been along the Ohio waters of the Ohio River since about 2012, at least near Cincinnati, but as of 2022, they have encroached up the Scioto to near Columbus. And this is one that gets a lot of negative press because if it gets into the Great Lakes, especially Western Lake Erie, which is very productive, it has the potential to really change the system in a big way. Fortunately, it's not there. So some pictures. Here is European frogbit. So my wife is a really good birder, and I get to follow her around and pretend I'm good at birding because I can kind of steal her knowledge and skill and pointing at things that she's already pointed out to me. But in any event, so we're always birding up in Northwest Ohio in the spring. In 2018, this was an open canal with water lilies back in the distance. And by 2019, you can see there is no open water. This is all European frogbit. It wasted no time. The spread of this plant is really amazing, especially because most of its reproduction is vegetative. It doesn't do much sexual reproduction. So really amazing. Yellow floating heart around central Ohio. Once again, no new invasions for decades, but recently on the move. Pink lotus up in Delaware County. Here's the new stand of hydrilla on Seneca Lake. Red swamp crayfish at Hilliard's Latham Park, which is a western suburb of Columbus, Ohio. Western mosquito fish from the Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge, and the silver carp moving up again into the interior of Ohio. Yay. So some information resources. The state of Ohio does have a kind of a clearinghouse for aquatic invasive species issues. Have a look if you are interested in what the state of Ohio is doing. I make a lot of use of the USGS database called the Non-Indigenous Aquatic Species Database, so-called NAS for short. And it is updated in real time, right? And as soon as they approve a report to the database, that range map is updated. The entries on it has a detailed collection of observations that's updated right away, and they will update fact sheets associated with each of these species. A really useful resource, but it depends upon user reports, right? So if you're out in the field and into this kind of thing, you see something, please report it because that makes the database better and it makes it more useful to people like me who use it. And this seems to me the database that's primarily used by agency professionals, right? People who are doing this kind of work related to management are likely using this database. Attached to this database is GLANSYS, the Great Lakes Aquatic Non-Indigenous Species Information System. This pulls data from the USGS, but it pulls it into a Great Lakes specific search engine. And it's a really powerful search engine. You can refine it by taxonomic group. You can define it by lake. You can refine it by the watershed around the lake. So a really useful search engine that, again, mostly pulls data from the USGS, but it adds some things that the USGS doesn't cover, especially plants.
And that's an affiliate of NOAA.
That is NOAA, right? It's operated by the NOAA lab and the NOAA in Ann Arbor, the Great Lakes Lab in Ann Arbor, and the Great Lakes Lab in Ann Arbor, I know, has lost its communication funding. Last I looked, this database was still operational. I hope it stays that way, but who knows? Because the current situation is just crazily unpredictable. The USDA plants database, which is, I've got the wrong acronym there. I feel really bad. That should now say USDA. Oh, well. I'm sure it was a sleep-induced typo. Please forgive me. Or a lack of sleep-induced typo, right? And it is quite useful, and you can narrow your search. It's got specifically a wetland search, and you can narrow that by region. You can narrow that by state. It's got a good search engine. But its range maps are color-coded, and they're color-coded statewide. And the color codes will be either native or not native or both. Statewide, and I sometimes take issue with those designations. So for example, it lists water lettuce as native to Ohio, which it definitely is not. So I don't know where the hell they got that. Usually it's really good, sometimes it's wacky. Use that caveat. EdMaps, which is kind of a citizen science driven thing, and much of its input is by cell app, right? So you're out in the field with a regional app, you observe a thing, you plug it into your app, and then it will feed in this EdMaps database. This is really good. It's got really good search engine. It's got really good range maps based on user reports though, right? But the user reports are verified before they enter the database, and really useful. This database seems to me to be most used by citizen scientists and academics. And iNaturalist, which is popular and growing in popularity all the time. Who's online and looking at what you submit is likely going to vary regarding the quality of the input you get on your own submissions, but it's out there. Be aware of it, make use of it, recognizing its caveats. New edition of the Ohio Field Guide to Aquatic Invasive Species, of which I'm a co-editor. I've got a small collection of those here. I've got more in my office, but I'm running low already, so grab them up if you want them. Hopefully there'll be another print run soon, and if you don't get one here today and wanted it, drop me a line so I can get it to you, but feel free to make use of this field guide. Some engagement. So let's start by talking about these kind of nationwide campaigns. Stop Aquatic Hitchhikers, which is a campaign targeted to people who engage in outdoor sport, right? If you're out there wading in the water or trailering a boat in the water, they've got the simple version of their message is clean, drain, dry. You got a piece of equipment in a body of water. When you take it out of that body of water, clean it, drain out any standing water, allow it to dry a bit before you move it to the next body of water. Message is more complicated than that. Clean, drain, dry is a simple version, but check it out if you engage in outdoor sport. Habitatitude campaign is a partnership among government entities, the industry players, which are going to be mostly pet stores and like water gardens, and also academics. And the essence of the Habitatitude program is to get people to be better stewards, be better educated, so they don't let Goldie out into the local pond, right? So check out these outreach campaigns. They're useful. If you are part of an organization that might be interested, they have partnership programs for organizations as well. And then I'd mentioned cell phone apps that feed the EdMap system. We have one in this region called the Great Lakes Early Detection Network, right? And so I am an administrator of this. So you go out in the field, you take a picture of a thing, it flags that photo with your location, latitude and longitude based on GPS in your phone, and you submit the report, and it will be approved by a professional before it goes into the database. Now, if it's an aquatic thing and it's submitted from Ohio, I'm the guy who does the approving, so take good pictures because I'm tired of driving. But feel free to download this app and make use of it. It's kind of cool. I can take questions, but the real purpose of this slide is I like to look at pictures of myself with fish. And that's where you can find me. So I was asked for 45 minutes. I gave you 55 or 53. So hopefully I'm not too overwhelming. You have questions?
the economic impacts of this are, probably what got everyone's attention first was zebra mussels.
Right.
A number of years ago.
Right.
But with things like, snakeheads and with milder winters, what's the predictability of certain species expanding beyond? You've referred to it a couple times where you had, well, I saw this and I didn't think it would be persistent, but it's persistent.
Sure.
That seems like an open-ended.
Sure. And those things, again, are kind of hard to predict because when we're talking about the natural systems that govern them, they're so complex that it's hard to know exactly what will happen until we actually observe it. But I do think that there are indications that things are changing. So, for example, the grass carp spawning thing, right? Which again, I thought when I saw that really kind of rogue year of 2011 with high water late into the season and warm weather coming on earlier, again, I thought this might be a 30-year anomaly, but now it's happening like every year. So those things are, it's hard to deny that those things are changing, and the kind of economic effects that they'll have in the wake is really hard to predict. So, for example, grass carp established in the wild. And now, right now, there is not anything like a large population. We have documented spawning events with frequency, but we don't have evidence of large numbers of juveniles or adults out in the wild. If they get to that point, they have the potential, because they're very effective herbivores. And where there are marshes that are open to Lake Erie, they have the potential to strip those marshes of aquatic plants, which will affect things like duck hunting, which will affect things like the natural ecosystem function of those marshes and filtering toxins and excessive nutrients from getting to the lake. So what the trickle down effect of that will be is hard to predict, and hopefully we can stave it off.
Well, since you're in predicting, the effect of, I know it's a single winter, but we seem to have had a proper winter
Right.
like we used to experience with Lake Erie nearly freezing solid. Do you expect that would have a dramatic impact upon any of these new players?
It may. So especially, for example, if the population is relatively small, you're more likely to stifle a larger proportion of them. So for especially new invasions, a strong winter for a southerly thing is likely going to substantially stall that new invasion. So yes, but unfortunately, it seems like our strong winters are becoming more of a rarity, and the number of times we have that benefit to look forward to is frankly probably not as great as it should be.
There's a pond maybe less than 2 miles from here in Concord Woods, artificially created when they created the Metropark. It's amazing how often I've walked around it and seen goldfish in it.
Oh yeah.
The place is surrounded by suburbs, so obviously people are letting goldie go. What impact would that have on a system like that?
Goldfish are actually very well studied, and they a couple big deal. If you release them to wetlands, they tend to hang out more around wood, where carp tend to hang out more around soft vegetation. But a large number of goldfish in an isolated wetland will strip it of its vegetation and make the substrate less stable, more likely to stir up and be muddy. And then when the substrate becomes muddy, you get less light penetration, so the plants can't come back. And so they do have a negative effect on wetlands, and they're actually one of the ones that are really well studied, especially in Canadian marshes. So yes, they have an effect in large numbers.
We had an introduction of a non-native that occurred to a wetland we created here at like Metroparks a number of years ago. It's a Girl Red Reservation. It's an interesting story. The wetland itself leaked. It was constructed over a sand seam, and we were having a problem where it got to a certain level and would not go any further. Right. And we found a polymer substance that we were able to take and introduce into the water. It bonded with sediment or silt in the water. Actually,
was it one of those multi-stage things?
Yeah, it was very cool. It cost effective. I mean,
Wow.
It was amazing. I mean, it absolutely was amazing. But as best we could determine, there was a plant introduced via the drum barrels that the product was shipped in.
Wow.
And, so
Or it might have even been a fragment on the barrel, right?
yeah, a plant, one of those asexual, plants that, could just grow off of the cell. And so it was discovered downstream of the outlet. And so it was like widespread panic, we were very concerned about this. And then we found that there was a aquatic plant propagator right upstream from the well. And that's where it came.
Oh, what was the plant? Do you?
I can't recall. It's been 20 years ago. But, it was really quite a interesting process because we took a lot of lumps from certain biologists in the community, and then with further digging, we found that no, it did not come off the barrel. It actually came from this
Somebody selling it.
propagator upstream.
Yeah. Hopefully, it's a plant that's now listed. I hope.
I can't recall what it was, Eugene, but it was a real kind of, oh crap, what did we do? Oh, what a relief, we didn't do it.
When things get, thinking about some of these invasives like gobies, or whatever, when they have absolutely taken over, there is really no talk about controlling them, is there?
That's an entirely different talk that I might give to a more professional audience, right? So very often they'll think in terms of an invasion curve, right? A new population comes into a place, never been there before, right? So you start with no population, right? And then the population increase, if it's a place that's suitable, and they find appropriate mates and can reproduce, is exponential. The increase in population is exponential, right? And then it will come into an equilibrium with its environment, with the existing community, and then that exponential increase in population will level off and start to wiggle around as the whims of the environment kind of prescribe. And so when you're managing these things, you think about where along that invasion curve you are. And so if you're here with the new population, you might have a goal of eradication, especially if you have a small managed site where you've got a lot of active management and the potential to eradicate a new population. But once you move up to here, where it's established and in equilibrium with its environment around, you're likely to still take management action, but that management action is not likely to be eradication with a goal of eradication, but rather, suppression to keep the numbers of things controlled to allow some of the natural ecosystem function to recover around it, right? So, yeah, you'll probably be still managing things, but your ultimate goal for the management changes. Sea lamprey is a good example, right? Invaded the Great Lakes, a parasitic fish, and they periodically put the TFM, which is a selective lampricide, relatively selective, right into the streams to kill larval lamprey. Yeah, exactly. But it's really hard on amphibians. It's really hard on scaleless fish. It's really hard on native lamprey, some of which are endangered. So the goal is not to eradicate sea lamprey because they're so widespread. The goal is only to suppress their numbers so that native fisheries like lake trout and lake whitefish might have a chance to recover a little bit to some kind of useful function.
It's been really interesting as an observer. I used to be at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, and my colleagues in natural areas have been battling phragmites and all sorts of other invasive plants in Meadow Marsh, and have pretty much transformed Meadow Marsh in the last 15 years in a really dramatic way.
Right.
It's amazing how much stuff has come back, including a patch of wild rice.
That's fantastic.
Which is, who knew that was in the seed bank.
I pursued some grant money to try to reestablish wild rice on one of the private hunting clubs, but I didn't get it, unfortunately.
Which club?
The Ottawa Shooting Club. Ottawa's right across from Linus. It's the second most prestigious, right? So that was a project that we intend to restore a dike marsh. There was a dike that had been washed out, and we intend to reestablish that dike and put grates at either end of the marsh to allow the stream to flow through. and allow the hydrology, because it's close enough to the lake that it was influenced by the lake's hydrology. And so we wanted to clear it of carp, stock a hyperdensity of muskellunge to suppress any juvenile carp that got in from becoming adults. The grates would keep the muskellunge captive and would prevent adult carp from coming in. And then with the improvements to water quality, we wanted to reestablish wild rice because the site was actually called Rice Pond historically. Well, we were seeking grant funding from Ducks Unlimited to rebuild this dike because they do marsh restoration work. And when I said muskellunge, they said, oh, they'll eat all the ducks, which is, you know, yeah, they'll eat an occasional duck, but it's total myth, right? They actually referred me to Coots Paradise, which is a marsh in Hamilton Harbor, where they said muskie had returned and ducks disappeared. Muskie had not returned to Coots Paradise. And I know the fisheries biologist who was collecting those data, a guy named Teismeyer. And so I wrote to him and said, we've not collected a muskie here in 100 years. Right. So they denied funding based upon fiction. Oh, well.
Any other questions? Well, thank you. This has been great. And what I intend to do is with the recording, this new recording, I will process it a bit, clean it up just a little bit. Maybe I can add some of the slides that we missed right at the very beginning to the video, and then I'll have it on YouTube. Ecophilia has a YouTube channel that I created. We also have a website. And if you don't have those links, write to Steve or to myself, Rich Benz. We can get you those links, and you can go back. Our intent is, with the website, just informational, to tell you what's coming up and what we've done in the past, and then also to put the links to the YouTube channel. The YouTube channel's intent is to archive these incredible talks. The resource that we have. He's going to go back down to Columbus in a bit, and you can write to him, but be able to see the information that he gave you is going to be on this YouTube channel, along with the links. So if you want to look at the link, you can't just touch it; you have to actually write it down. But at least it's there, and you have the resources. And our intent is to have those ongoing and on-living. So if you have any questions about Ecophilia, again, write to Steve, myself, Harvey, Dan, and we're always looking for speakers. So, the way our model right now is every other month we have a speaker like we had with Eugene, and then on the opposite month we're looking to have in-person kind of informal gatherings at various locations. Steve might be able to talk a little bit about that as that kind of solidifies, but kind of in the realm of the old science cafe. But just a quick introduction and then some discussion over some refreshments. The first one we had wasn't a quick introduction because it was me and I kept talking. And our quick introduction ended up being about an hour and a half. We did have the refreshments.
We had a good time.
So with that, we'll end our talk, and thank you, Gene, very much.
Of course, the tradition is if you give a program to Ecophilia, you are now a member of Ecophilia.
Cool.
Welcome to the club.
I'll add it to my resume.
Thank you very much.